so that we can be with you in the next. Lord, I pray that you give us open minds and hearts. And Lord, we just give this night to you. We give our discussion. We give our time in prayer to you. Lord, that your will be done. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So, I remember I was in 9th grade. I was standing. There you go. You're in 9th grade. Congratulations. Yeah, I was in 9th grade, and here at the parish, we were hosting a group of Franciscans, specifically Franciscans who are part of the Friars of the Renewal. They're known as the CFRs. They live in the Bronx, New York. They're incredible guys. As I was sitting with them, I was in 9th grade. I had never met a religious brother before. So, you see, nuns and brothers and, monks and stuff in movies. But I had never seen one in real life. He was standing in front of me. There were actually 3 or 4 of them. And they have big beards, no hair, besides the beard. And they were sitting there, they were playing guitar, they rode skateboards, they loved God, and I was like, these things start to align with what I want in my life. I like skateboards, I like guitars, I like the Lord. And for the first time in my life, as I was standing before this Franciscan friar of the Renewal, I said, you know what? That life looks actually pretty interesting. That life looks like a life that I could live. That life looks like something that I could desire. And as we began last week talking about, in a series of vocations, desire, a desire for relationship, I want you to know that as we talk about vocations tonight, all of these vocations have been designed by God the Father to bring you closer to Him. All of them. I think sometimes we look at something like the priesthood or religious life, and we're like, oh yes, those people are way close to God, and I don't know if I'm that close, so I'm just going to stay over here. I'm just going to go in the easy lane of marriage, right? And a lot of times, maybe in your small group last week, we had just a simple question of which vocation do you maybe feel called to, and maybe your instinct is why would I even think about anything other than marriage? That's just the easy option. I've never given thought, I've never even been able to visualize myself being in religious life. And I think as we enter into tonight, I want you to know that your vocation is not a test. It's not something to put a ton of pressure on of, man, if I get this right or if I get this wrong, my life is going to be ruined or my life is going to be absolutely perfect. Nothing will ever go wrong. Vocations are meant to call us to the Father, which means that no matter which vocation we're called to, no matter which one we live out, we're going to be growing in holiness and growing towards God. And that's ultimately the intention. And I want to walk through each of the vocations tonight and walk through what they actually look like. Because for some of us, we may have met a nun before. We've met Father Jack. You know your parents. You've met people who are married. And those are things that either you've thought about or maybe you haven't. Maybe you've given some of these vocations absolutely zero thought. Well, tonight is the night to sort of present them to you and to do a little bit of a deep dive into what they actually look like. So as we begin with our vocations, I want to begin, there's ultimately a natural calling for all of us. And that's what Joey was getting at last week when he was talking about desire and relationship. There's a natural calling within all of us for relationship and for belonging. We are not meant to be alone. God did not design us for loneliness. He designed us to be in relation with another. And for a lot of us, that relationship comes with a natural calling. A natural calling. We have natural callings of marriage, and there's sort of a supernatural of laying that aside and choosing celibacy and entering into religious life. We're going to get to that in a second, but I want to start with that natural calling of marriage. This is a vocation that for almost all of us, we're probably going to go into. This is probably the vocation for most of the people in this room, because this vocation is vital. This is a vital vocation, not only for society, but for the church. It's a calling that ultimately most of us will have. But there are 4 elements that go into marriage. And I want to look at those because as we look at this as a sacrament, as a vocation, it's important that we recognize these 4. A marriage must be free, total, faithful, and fruitful. Let's walk through those. First off, free. This marriage must be freely chosen. It must be something that both parties are mutually choosing. Despite what will come in the years following, in the years to come throughout this marriage, I say freely yes to you now. As I stand before this altar, as I stand before God, I say I do. Freely to you now, right? I remember I was in my brother's wedding. I was his best man, and we were all getting a picture beforehand, and we all had beers, and we were going to cheers with our beers. Because my brother, for some reason, wanted this picture. I don't know why. My brother, hates beer. I don't know why he wanted this photo, but he did. And so we're sitting in the vestry, so where the priest gets dressed for Mass, and they get ready. And the priest was off in another side of the room, and we all pull out a beer, and we all cheers for the picture, and it makes a very loud clink, right? We all cheers glass bottles against each other. It was very obvious what was happening. And from across the room, I hear the priest. He was an Irishman, and he said, "None of you better be drinking those beers in there." And I was like, "Excuse me, what?" He comes in and he was like, "Not one of you takes a sip." And I was like, we weren't planning on it. We're here for a photo, right? I don't know why my brother wants this, but he wants it. And what he was getting at is that even something like alcohol cannot be consumed the morning of your wedding, because that would inhibit your freedom to choose, because it would inhibit your ability to freely choose the sacrament. The church takes it to even that extreme, right? For some of us, that might seem extreme. We don't believe, obviously, in arranged marriages as Catholics. It has to be a free choice. Total. So it's free, it's total. This is an entire gift of self, a lifelong partnership. And it's ultimately in this gift of self through marriage that we find ourselves. I can tell you that I don't know if I truly knew myself until I got married. Once I got married, I started to realize a lot of things about myself, a lot of ways that I was selfish, a lot of ways that I needed to die to myself so that I could serve another. It's ultimately a vocation that a lot of us think of. We're going to go into it for me. I have a plan of I want this perfect family. I have a plan of I want someone who's going to serve me. But marriage is about the opposite of that. It's not about being served, it's about serving. It's about bringing up a family, God willing, into the kingdom of heaven and serving that family in a total gift of self. And I think our culture has shifted this, and it has this mindset of, all right, if this doesn't work, I'll just get a divorce. But we as Catholics believe in this total gift of self. It has to be totally given. And we believe that there are some circumstances in which what's called an annulment can be done, and that marriage can be divorced in a sense, but there's a lot of very specific details that would go into that. We don't have time for that tonight. But there are circumstances in which the church would say this marriage, in a sense, never was. But as we come to this sacrament, it has to be a free choice, and it has to be a total gift of self. I am in this for the long haul. It has to be faithful. There is a design of sexual intimacy that Joey was talking about last week, this desire for relationship. And as we enter into marriage, it's a faithful yes that I give of, I am faithful to you and you alone. I am faithful to this marriage. And I'm not going to go off with another, right? So it's free, total, faithful, and finally fruitful. The church, obviously, be fruitful and multiply. You'll hear oftentimes from Scripture. And the church obviously loves kids. We as Catholics, there are kids everywhere, right? St. John Paul II said, the future of society passes by way of the family. It's vital that the family exists for society itself, not only for our church, but for society. So as you're entering into this vocation, you're saying yes to a gift of self to the point of a desire to bear children, right? And there's some who cannot bear children, and maybe they don't figure that out, and they don't find that out until they're married. But within this sacrament, within this vocation, we're called to bear life, and to at least be open to that life. And a lot of times this is where we as a church butt heads with the culture, because culture would say love is love, and you can marry anyone, right? But we as a church know the gift of sexuality, know the gift of companionship, know the gift of life. And we support this to the point of saying that marriage must be open to this. And a lot of times this is one of the arguments that is used in terms of homosexuality and same-sex marriage. This is one argument that is used of why the church is against this, because it is not capable of bearing life naturally. So, marriage leads us ultimately to a greater unity as society, as a church, and this vocation ultimately calls us to holiness is the desire. Let's move on. Marriage to religious life. This is that supernatural calling, right? This call of celibacy, of leaving behind that intimacy, and calling of a deeper calling, a supernatural calling to serve the church in a very radical way. A lot of us know those who are in religious life, the one that we come across most often is priests, right? They receive holy orders, they administer sacraments. This is biblically based. Jesus established this royal priesthood from all the way through the Old Testament to Jesus himself, establishing this as a sacrament that we return to. And for a lot of priests, I don't know if you guys are aware of like the average day of a priest. They're all over the place. They can go from a morning mass that's celebrated all the way to a funeral, all the way to administration stuff, money. They're in charge of finances for the parish. They have a lot of people who help them. But priests wear a lot of hats. And it's really a life of teaching and of preaching, of visiting those in need, and of serving those within your parish community. And there's a few types. There's diocesan priests, there's military chaplains, there's those who are in religious orders that are priests. But this is the most common. But next I want to go into that consecrated life. So your nuns, your friars, your brothers, your sisters, these are those who have consecrated their life to a life of community, a life of prayer, and they all share 3 vows. So they vow to chastity, poverty, and obedience. And when you're going into consecrated life, we're going to talk a lot about discernment next week, but I want to walk through real quick what it looks like to actually get to this point. A lot of times we might think that, all right, you show up at the friary and you just get your habit, you instantly look like this, like you show up and there's like, all right, here you go, here's your habit, and you are a nun now, right? No, this is a long process. It's a process that takes a few years. Begins with candidacy. This takes about 6 months. It's sort of living within the community, getting familiar with it. This is also called postulate in some communities, but it's living in this community and starting to sort of discern if this is for me or not. You then move on to novitiate, where you're officially called a sister. This typically lasts about not 6 years, a year. And it's praying specifically about the vows that you're about to take. So we'll get to the vows in just a second, but you spend life in community, 6 months to a year. You move into novitiate, which is about a year long. So about 2 years in, you take temporary vows. And this is your first time taking those vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. And these are vows that canonically bind you. I know that's a big word, canonically, but like within the laws of the church, you're bound to these vows for typically about a year to 3 years. So these are temporary, right? I do know people who have taken those first vows, and then they've discerned that this is not actually a vocation that I'm called to. I personally know people who have taken those temporary vows and discerned a different vocation. So it's just a temporary vow that's taken, and typically there's a period there, and it depends on the community, but you live within the community with those vows for a certain amount of time before you take your perpetual vows. This is, in a sense, when you're locked in, right? Anywhere from 3 to 9 years, depending on the community, where you're taking these final vows and saying, no, I belong to this community. I vow to chastity, obedience, and poverty. And what does this community life look like? Before we get to sort of what each religious life can look like specifically, they have a very specific day most of the time. There's a very specific schedule most of the time for these communities, rising at 5 a.m. This is just an example of one that I found. 5:30 a.m. morning prayer, that sounds really early. 6:30 a.m. Holy Mass, 7:45 breakfast, 9:30 morning chores and classes, 12:50 midday prayer, 11:30 lunch, 2:30 free time and siesta, 4:30 vespers and meditation, 6 o'clock private time, 7:30 dinner, 8:30 night prayer, 9:30 lights out because you got to get up at 5. But for a lot of us, this can look like a schedule that might be a little daunting, a little overwhelming. But I present this to you to sort of give you an idea of what a life within religious life can actually look like. It's a life that's ordered and a life that's focused ultimately on God, a life that's focused on prayer, a life that's focused on work, a life that's focused on drawing closer to the Lord. And there's a few ways that this is lived. So there are 3 types of religious orders. The first one that we're going to walk through is those who are monastic or cloistered. So these are what you usually think of with a nun, right? So they pray all day long. They're sort of locked within their monastery. And this is exactly the one that we typically have within our mind. They focus on inward conversion, and they live lives of prayer and of work. They typically have little interaction with the world so that they can change the world through prayer, right? We believe in the power of prayer. We believe that it's something that can change the world truly. And it's not that they're removing themselves from the world so that they're not a part of it. No, they're very, very active within the world, but it's just through a life of prayer. Let's walk through, I've got 3 of these communities that I want to sort of just show you guys what they look like. The Benedictines first. They have a charism of prayer, of constant prayer. You'll see them in black. These were one of the first group of monks started by St. Benedict who lived in community. They have a motto of ora et labora, which means prayer and work. They're noted for Gregorian chant, so if you've ever heard monks chanting, it comes from these guys. But they've also got their opposite side of the nuns, the Benedictine nuns. So you've got the monks, you've got the nuns, on both sides of the Benedictines. And there's a subset of Benedictines, because Benedictines themselves oftentimes will live within the world in a certain context. We have a friend who is actually a Benedictine monk, or a Benedictine friar in Kansas at the University of Benedictine. And he teaches, so he goes and he teaches a high school class. So he, in a sense, interacts with the world, and that's his work that he does. But there is a subset of the Benedictines called the Trappists, and they live very different lives. They don't necessarily come in contact often with the world as much as the Benedictines do, but they're a sub-order of the Benedictines. They have a stricter observance of monastic life, but they're known for typically the things that they offer. They're the ones who, if you've ever had like monk chocolate or monk coffee or monk honey, they're typically the ones that are making these kinds of things. So they typically invest in a real way in work in order to be able to serve the kingdom of God. And then last but not least for these cloistered is the Carthusians. So you'll see that these two, the nun on the left, the monk on the right, are alone, right? These Carthusians take this call to isolation from the world very seriously. They don't only isolate from the world, but they, in a large sense, isolate from one another. So they typically eat meals alone, they study alone. They do have moments where they come into community together, but they're completely separate from the world. So they're often not going and interacting with the world in any way. These Carthusians are oftentimes, they're called the Order of Hermits. So they live in community, but they oftentimes are strictly on their own. So we have these who are they're cloistered, those who live away from the world, but there's also a beautiful set who are sort of called the active orders. We start with the mendicant. They're sisters and brothers, and mendicant means begging. So they live solely off of the money and the things that are given to them. So they live solely off of alms. So you'll see these brothers or these sisters begging for their next meal, begging for their next place to sleep, because they live solely off of what God provides for them. And they don't necessarily live in a convent or a monastery, but they often live a little bit more inside of the world, the opposite of what we've just discussed. One of these examples is the Franciscans. They began in the 13th century under St. Francis. They live a life of simplicity, they live solely off of the generosity of others. These Franciscans, I love the picture on the left, that Franciscan friar just laughing hysterically. I just want to post that on my wall and laugh at that constantly. The Franciscans often live in service of the poor primarily. I talked about those CFRs earlier, the Friars of the Renewal. They're out of New York, but they're all over the place. These guys are amazing. They skateboard. They have music that they play. You can find it on YouTube. Brother Isaiah there. They've got a podcast, Poco a Poco. These guys are in the world in a very radical way, praying for those in need, serving the poor. They are absolutely incredible. And then last but not least for these mendicant are the Dominicans. Thumbs up. The Dominicans are often known for their focus on Catholic education. Thomas Aquinas, Catherine of Siena, these great doctors of the church who often argue very deep arguments about the church. Oftentimes they're Dominicans because that's their focus, is education, providing for sort of the mental needs of those who are trying to learn about the faith. So last but not least, we have our cloistered, those who are living a monastic life, who are away from the world. We have our mendicant, who are within the world. And last but not least, we have our canon regulars. These are, the religious orders that often live within local parishes. So the Jesuits are an example of these. They are priests who are not only priests, but they're also, they take religious vows. Father Tran, if you remember him, he was our previous priest. He was a Jesuit, actually. So they live within parish life. So you'll just see them as normal priests. Oftentimes you might not even recognize that they are in a religious order until you get an email from them and it's signed underneath and you're like, oh, he's a Jesuit. Cool. So these guys often live within actual parish life. So they're not off at a friary or anything like that. They're living within parishes, but living within a community as well. So these are some of the religious life vocations. There's also hermits, which gets a little confusing because you're like, okay, so we're supposed to live not isolated, we're supposed to live amongst one another, and then these guys just go off and do their own thing, right? So the hermits live a life of prayer, they're isolated from community, but they profess vows to the bishop. So there are hermits within the Archdiocese of Atlanta that are serving our bishop, and they're praying for our diocese, but they live off on their own. Sometimes they'll go to Mass at parishes, so you'll see someone at Mass maybe, and you have no clue that they're a hermit, but they're living entirely a life isolated from the world, and they're living a life of prayer, but they serve directly